Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. We do so by painting an accurate picture of that journey from the perspective of the justice-involved individual. Too often, our perceptions of those individuals are tainted by media-driven caricatures created to sell newspapers or movie tickets. This adds little to a healthy dialogue as to how to best address criminality and the reintegration process. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please, welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 76 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. As noted, we are now 76 episodes into this weekly podcast, and by now have hopefully established some themes. One of those themes, of course, is just as there are multiple pathways into crime and delinquency, there are also multiple pathways out. And again, as discussed previously on this program and over on our YouTube channel as well, the process of examining those pathways out is at times referred to as desistance. Desistance from crime, desistance from delinquency. Now, if you are a practitioner or administrator who is operating under the risk, need, responsivity model, you are aware that the risk, need, responsivity approach focuses on an examination of those risk factors which correlate with the acquisition and maintenance of what we refer to as criminogenic variables. We know, thanks to the needs principle, that if we address those variables, we will see a subsequent decrease in recidivism. But as I and others have pointed out, that approach is missing a large part of the equation when it comes to the change process. That is, we're ignoring those variables and indeed the phenomenon of exiting from a criminal lifestyle. Which is why I am so very excited to be bringing you the brilliant insights of my next guest. Dr. Fergus Mcneill is a professor of criminology and social work at the University of Glasgow, where he works in the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research in Sociology. Prior to becoming an academic in 1998, Fergus worked for 10 years in residential and drug rehabilitation and as a criminal justice social worker. He has co-written and co-edited several books and publications and is currently leading a project, which he will speak of shortly, known as Distant Voices Coming Home. This is an initiative that uses creative practices to explore crime, punishment, and reintegration. I am so pleased to share my recent conversation with Dr. Fergus Mcneill with you. Please enjoy this enlightening interview, and I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome to the show, Fergus. Why don't we start off by you telling our audience a little bit about yourself, just generally speaking, a bit about your background, both educationally and professionally.
Okay, thanks for having me, first of all. I am currently Professor of Criminology and Social Work at the University of Glasgow. I've been there a long time. 1998 is when I arrived. Prior to that, I was a criminal justice social worker, also known as a probation or a parole officer in the city of Glasgow in the 1990s. And before that, also spent a few years working in and living in residential drug rehab, that was my first stop after an undergraduate degree in philosophy and history. So that's the short version.
I love the short version. We highlight your work and the work of others on the show when we explore various themes around desistance from crime. So maybe for some newer listeners, give an overview on your interpretation, your definition of desistance from crime, and then maybe tell us what drew you to that topic as well.
Okay, so I've tended to conceptualization. Sorry, I've tended to conceptualize desistance as always as a process of human development, but one which is inescapably and irretrievably rooted in social and cultural contexts. So I guess that's the social worker in me, always wanting to see individual human development within a wider context of systems, I guess. So in terms of how I came to it, the honest answer is by accident. Around about the turn of the century, 2000, I was commissioned to do some work for a local authority here. That would mean a county, I guess, in the States. And they wanted to understand better the profile of young people who they were working with on account of persistent offending. So we did a case file analysis of young people who were very persistent offenders in their caseload. And we also did a literature review to look at research around persistent offending by young people that might inform the development of better practice. And it was in the context of doing that literature review, just asking around, really, in Scotland, first of all, that I was put in touch with Stephen Farrell and his work, and then I think it went from Steve to Shad Maruna, and quickly the field of desistance, as it was around 2000, opened up, and I think I just immediately recognised in it something that was very important, very pertinent, and something which had been missing in my own education and development as a criminal justice social worker and even as a criminologist in the first stages of that journey. The emphasis back in the 90s was so much on what works research, on treatment research, really, that very little attention was being paid at that time to the wider social context of offending and of rehabilitation. And it was when I first engaged with desistance research that I saw that there was indeed a body of evidence that kind of expanded our conception of what evidence-based practice might involve.
When I speak to individuals about desistance who have never heard of it or are new to it, I tend to speak in three larger themes, and I'm sure I picked this up from you or Shad or Stephen Farrell, but I tend to talk in these, again, broader themes of it's about augmenting an individual's human capital, building that social capital, and then, of course, that critical element of identity transformation. How close am I, Fergus, when I talked about desistance in those three major silos, if you will?
Yeah, no, as far back as 2007 in the first book I co-authored, which was on reducing reoffending, we had already then separate chapters on developing human capital and developing social capital in relation to desistance. Nowadays I would use a different three-part framework. So Steve and Shad came up with the distinction between primary and secondary desistance, which basically matches the distinction between primary and secondary deviance. So primary refers to the act itself, or in the case of desistance, the absence of the act. But secondary refers to an underlying shift in identity associated with a change in behaviour. So whereas secondary deviance is about internalising the label as an offender or as a drug user or whatever else, secondary desistance is about coming to see yourself as different from who you've been in the past. And I added to their framework a third level or layer, which is tertiary desistance, and that refers to the development of a sense of belonging in a community. So you can have behaviour change, you can have identity change, but if the identity change isn't recognised and supported and even celebrated by people around you, then it stays vulnerable and fragile. So that to me, to seal the deal of desistance is to find a community within which you're accepted as a desister.
Yeah, and I'm familiar with those demarcations, if you will, as well, which really leads to my next question here. When I speak of primary and secondary desistance, again, it's sort of that behavioral is that first level, if you will, which we're still hung up on in the U.S. We obsess on recidivism rates. In the United States, we try to utilize the risk-need responsivity approach, but the unfortunate reality is that we're still very much a containment model, in my opinion. So to what degree do you think there are deeper systemic or cultural differences between the United States and the United Kingdom in which that ground just may simply be more fertile on your side of the Atlantic for desistance to take hold?
Yeah, I think in Scotland specifically, and in Ireland actually, people who work in probation and parole are still trained as social workers in the first instance. In England and Wales, it's different. They do a different, more specialised, more criminal justice focused form of training. But historically, probation work in the UK has been rooted in social work and a close sibling of it. In the States, although there is as I understand it, a sub-discipline of forensic or correctional social work, most people that are working in, what's the right word, client-facing criminal justice functions, in correctional services, I guess, are not social work trained. And I understand that there's a lot of variety across the different states of the United States. But from what I've learned about it from the literature and from conversations with colleagues in North America, it's been a massive effort to move from a central preoccupation with control and law enforcement towards any kind of re-engagement with the process of trying to support people to change, basically, and also trying to support them in ways which extend beyond individual or personal change, but also go beyond into community contexts and trying to create climates and cultures within which it's possible to lead different lives.
Yeah, lots of work to do, which is why I'm always excited to talk to individuals such as yourself so we can learn more and hopefully change the way we do business. I was excited to note you were coming on the show. I asked my listeners for any questions that they may want to ask of you. This question is from Ed in Minneapolis, who wants to know, what are some of the big issues currently or questions for desistance theory and research? That is, what direction do you feel the field may be headed here as we move into the 21st century?
Yeah, I think there's two or three things I would pick out. One is about the diversification of desistance research. So, like much of criminology, I think there's a legitimate criticism of desistance research that it's been preoccupied with the experience of mostly young white men, mostly in the USA and the UK, and that diversifying that in terms of cultural diversity, different minority ethnic communities, is important. Diversifying it in terms of gender is crucially important because we are learning that desistance is different for women. And also, we're only beginning to see the development of desistance research in the global south, and that's really interesting, where different state civil society formations create different assets and liabilities in relation to supporting desistance. So there's a kind of southern criminology angle on desistance, which I think we need to see develop as soon as possible. The other thing I would say, though, I think for me the most fundamental challenge to desistance research has emerged from within desistance research. Let me try and explain this. I think the more that I study desistance, the more that I think the real problem is criminalisation, not crime. I'm not saying that crime isn't a real problem, but I think that the ways that we respond to crime through criminalisation and penalisation are so counterproductive that often what people need to desist from is criminal justice involvement. So it's not just about, or even centrally about, a change in their behaviour. It's about whether or not the criminal justice system is ever going to let them go, and if so, under what conditions.
I'm going to struggle to complete the interview now, Fergus, because that just blew my mind, and I could just sit and reflect on that. I'm going to circle back to that theme here in a second, but just a quick follow-up question that Ed had was, and you noted this in speaking with your North American context, there are pockets of hope, to coin a phrase here in the U.S., for more progressive agencies that are introducing their staff to the theory of desistance and some of those fledgling interventions. So what are things that probation and parole officers can do in their daily practice to promote desistance with their clients? Shy of some agency-wide introduction of a new practice model or anything like that, but just something that a progressive-minded PO who might be listening can say, Dr. Mcneil, what can I start doing in my daily practice with my caseload to promote desistance in the folks I work with?
Well, I think it begins with recognition of the worth of every individual. Alison Liebling would say the same about trying to rethink how we approach people who are going through imprisonment, that we begin with recognition and communication of moral worth. And that sounds kind of abstract, maybe a little bit airy-fairy, but there's nothing more important in supporting desistance, as far as I understand it, than establishing a relationship within which change and supporting change is enabled. And that's a kind of reciprocal process where trust emerges and develops and is tested and retested. So a good PO needs to understand the centrality of the relationship and the kind of qualities that they need to build into the relationship. They need to understand that the process is a complicated and difficult one, and that there will be setbacks. People who are in established or entrenched patterns of behaviour won't easily change them. So setbacks and lapses are to be expected, and the question is not will they happen, but rather how will we manage them when they happen. Then I would say it's about respect for individuality and diversity. We need to understand that although there are general patterns, everyone's desistance journey is different. And one of the PO's tasks is to understand that individual in their context, and to try to kind of do an inventory, if you like, of what personal resources and attributes and assets they have that might enable progress, and also what community assets and resources are available to them, maybe in the family or the extended family, or in faith communities, or in communities of interest built around any legal activity, let's say. So that kind of inventory building that respects the individuality of the process for different people. Other things, the communication of hope and belief in the possibility of change is really very important. And that links to the importance of agency in desistance processes, people discovering the sense that they can guide and direct their own lives. And that's easier to do if you're being supported by someone who tries to work with you in partnership rather than trying to do things to you. And, one of the worst things you can do to people is try to fix them. Whatever the Coldplay song says, it doesn't, to be treated by somebody in that way is actually to be stigmatized. It's to say you are faulty and I am not, and I can fix you because I'm all right, but you're not, which is the opposite, really, of what we're trying to communicate in respect of desistance, which is about the recognition of worth and human potential. So then it's reinforcement, it's celebration of small steps, it's advocacy work to make connections, to constructive community connections, all of those things. So it's about the way that the individual is conceived, respected and valued. It's about the way that they are seen within a network of social relations. And it's about the thoughtful attempt to pull those resources, individual and social, together to support the journey.
Yeah, and as you replied, I kept thinking to myself, Fergus, it is such a shift from the very risk-averse model we have now, which, again, as you alluded to, is so binary, so pass-fail, and, again, not really looking at the trajectory of an individual.
Yeah, and it also, it's very damaging to that working relationship, because if I'm the client or the probationer, and I think that your preoccupation as the practitioner is risk, I'm not going to tell you anything about my struggles, because I'm going to be fearful that if I disclose that I'm struggling, you're going to react to that in a way which is risk averse. So the logic of risk actually can atrophy the relationships that we need to support change, and getting that balance right, because obviously it's appropriate for probation and parole staff to be concerned with risk and to try to actively manage and reduce risks, but to reduce risks sometimes requires you to take risks. This is the conundrum, I guess, that practitioners have to face on a day-to-day basis, when to take action which might be precautionary, and when to take sensible, measured risks to give people opportunities to show that they can reward the trust that you might place in them.
Yeah, so much work we have to do culturally, changing that mindset from, as you said, that beginning with risk-averse, sort of CYA, and then if I have time, I'll get around to that relationship-building piece and looking at building those strengths and hope and everything else you said there. Let's change gears a little bit. I have read your book, Pervasive Punishment, Making Sense of Mass Supervision. In fact, you just alluded to this a bit earlier when you talked about sort of breaking folks not from their own criminality, but from the criminal justice system itself. Let's talk about the book. I am from Minnesota, which is a state which on the one hand prides itself for having very, very low rates of incarceration, but again, one of those unintended consequences that people sometimes neglect is, on the flip side, we have tens of thousands of people, more than that, on supervision, which sort of become this forgotten phenomenon. So talk a little bit about your book, Pervasive Punishment, Making Sense of Mass Supervision.
Yeah, sure. And when I was in Minneapolis last, I also learned that you have people on probation for incredibly long terms by comparison with European standards. I think the longest that you can be on the equivalent order in Scotland would be 3 years, and that's extremely unusual. Mostly, I think the average length of an order is 15 months in Scotland. So yeah, that basically the book
to
is
give your European listeners, our European listeners, a sense of what you're talking about there. It's not uncommon in Minnesota to have probation terms of 10. I've seen 20-year probations.
Yeah.
Which, when I read your book, is why it resonated so much, because I was, as a practitioner, living this phenomenon.
Yeah. So it's called Pervasive Punishment for two reasons. One is about the pervasiveness of this form of punishment, supervisory forms of punishment, in the lives of those that are subject to them. But the other refers to pervasiveness of these kinds of punishment in society. And I give a few examples in the book of, I mainly speak about the USA, drawing on the work of another person based in Minneapolis, Michelle Phelps. I use her work to discuss the USA, but I also look at European level research and zone in at times on my own country, Scotland, where the number of people subject to supervision rose 8-fold, I think, between 1980 and 2010, which is an even bigger growth than in the States, incidentally, although from a much, much lower base. So we went from just 2,000 or 3,000 people in the country on probation in 1980 to 20,000 in 2015-16, I think, is the last stats that I had in the book. And we were doing that to try to reduce the prison population, like in many places, but the prison population over the same period went up by 60%. So we had a total correctional population, as it's sometimes called, which rose from 8,000 in Scotland to almost 30,000 once you wrap in all the different kinds of correctional control. And that makes us, as one of my American colleagues, Sarah Armstrong, describes it, a little bit like we're like the Texas of Europe. in Scotland because we have one of the highest correctional rates in the continent. I know that it'll sound ridiculous to an American audience, but these things are always relative. So by European standards, we have a huge proportion of our population under correctional control at any one time, and yet we pride ourselves on being a progressive country, almost Nordic, in fact, in our aspirations, if not in these numbers. So the book's about trying to understand how that paradox can be explained, and also to persuade the reader why we should care. Like, the phenomenon of mass incarceration has been much studied and much analysed, and I think it's increasingly accepted that that's a huge problem in the States of racialised injustice, and in other places, like in my country, it's more like a class-based injustice or a place-based injustice. But the dynamics are similar. But in neither place, neither in the States nor in Scotland, has supervision and its expansion to this mass scale attracted similar attention. So my book's basically trying to do that, trying to make something which is invisible visible, and trying to do that in a way that invites the reader to imagine themselves in the position of a supervisee so that they can start to think about what that might feel like, what the implications might be for your life and for your family, and why the endless expansion of this form of punishment should also concern us if we want to live in a civilized country.
You mentioned that approach that you took. I know you utilized the fictitious character of Joe to sort of reflect on his journey through the supervision process to make it a bit more relatable. If anyone listened to my early podcast episodes, I took that approach as well, right? I just sort of ginned up about a dozen fictitious characters to, again, as you said, have the layperson or friends, family understand what that journey is like. What inspired you to take that approach of, again, sort of using a sort of straw man, if you will, to illustrate the X's and O's of what you were trying to convey?
Yeah, so I knew that this invisibility was a problem, and that the lack of representations of supervision in popular culture meant that it was almost literally unimaginable to potential readers. But to answer your question more directly, just before I started writing the book, I was speaking to my wife about it, and she's an elementary school teacher. We call them primary schools over here. And she's an avid reader of books, but almost always fiction books. So I said to her, are you going to read this book that I'm writing? She doesn't usually read criminology. And she said, I don't know, are you going to make it interesting? And I said, well, what would make it interesting? And she said, I like stories and I like characters. And I thought about it for a minute, and actually I went off on a train journey to the British Criminology Conference in Cardiff, and I thought I would just use the train journey to have to experiment with fictionalising some of the book's content. So I wrote the first episode of the story on that train journey and presented it to her when I got home, and she liked it. She said basically it intrigued her. It made her want to know what was going to happen next to the characters involved, not just Joe, but also the supervisor, Pauline. And basically that as a result of that, every chapter of the book opens with another episode of the short story. And they're all constructed very carefully, I should say, because I am a social scientist. The stories are as evidence-based as the rest of the book. So, okay, I don't put references in the stories because I don't want the reader to be derailed by having to check the citations. But the citations are in the chapter that follows. The evidence base for why the story is as it is in the book. It's just I'm trying to present that research in a way which is more vivid, by situating it in the unfolding life of Joe and the life of Pauline as his supervisor. And the feedback seems to be, by and large, that device works very well to engage the reader and to bring the issues to life, which is exactly the intention.
Yeah, it worked. It worked on me 100%. I kid myself for struggling how to pronounce this word, but I want to talk to you a little bit about the concept of ethnographies, and more to the point, ethnographies of supervision and reentry, which you really talk about in chapter 5 of the book when you touch on supervisable and making supervision visible.
Yeah, so it took me a long time myself, as somebody who'd worked in this field and who should have known better than most people about supervision. It took me a long time to recognise what we might think of as its darker side, like the suffering that is entailed in being supervised. And it was reading ethnographies that first brought that home to me. To explain a little bit, in the 90s and in the noughties, like the 2000 to 2010 period, most probation research or supervision research was based on interviews. And it's good research, but there are a couple of problems with interview-based research when it comes to supervision. One problem is selection biases. So the people that you get to interview are usually people that are compliant with supervision and doing pretty well on supervision. They're the easy ones to get to through your gatekeepers. The second problem is social desirability biases. You know, the people that you speak to probably want to say nice things by and large, either to please you or to please the gatekeeper. So you've got another layer of bias. And then a third dynamic, which hadn't occurred to me until we began discussing this in a European network on supervision that I led between 2012 and 2016. The methodology of the interview perfectly mirrors the methodology of the practice, right? So when you sit down with a set of questions, you're doing exactly what the PO does. And the proximity between the two experiences, therefore, may have an effect on the kind of stories that you elicit. And so when I started reading ethnographies of supervision based on observation and of being alongside people in a variety of more embedded ways, it became apparent that there was a darker side that we were missing. And I mean, that's very apparent, for example, in Reuben Miller's new book, Halfway Home, which talks about the supervised society in the States, another take on mass supervision. And in Reuben's case, he very powerfully articulates the racialized dynamics of mass supervision in the States. It's a wonderful book. But other people, Jan Dernescu had managed to get past the interview problem, I think by sticking with his participants a bit more deeply than most interviewers do, and had done a wonderful study on the pains of probation a few years previously. Alexandra Cox has a great ethnography of juvenile justice in a northeastern American state. There's a bunch of others. Robert Worth in California, whose ethnographies of parole are very powerful. They all tell a different story from the interview-based research. And so in the European network, we wanted to explore that further, and we settled on trying to use some creative methods for a variety of reasons. The simple reason was that we couldn't find any visual representations of supervision beyond the one or two images that appear on the websites of European probation services, which tend to be either pictures of people sitting at desks, very dull, or pictures of people wearing orange high-vis vests while they do community work, kind of like a chain gang, but not as brutal, perhaps. Same sort of visualization in one way. So we thought, well, why don't we get people subject to supervision themselves to represent that visually? And why don't we, in a sister project called Picturing Probation, get supervisors to take pictures that represent their work? So the sister projects were called Supervisable, which was the supervisees taking the pictures, and Picturing Probation, which was the probation officers taking the pictures. And they were fantastically rich projects that generated really interesting images. I was involved more with the Supervisible project and was really, to be honest, slapped in the face by the visual metaphors that the supervisees chose, which were mostly about constraint, judgment, waste, the suspension of time, and then more positively growth. Actually, most of those themes that emerged were ambivalent. They could go both ways. So growth could be painful and positive. Waste could sometimes be the sense that you were being treated like, can I swear on your podcast?
Of course.
Treated like shit. And at other times it was the sense that you were getting rid of your shit, which was experienced as a good thing. Time suspended could be time out of a chaotic life in a constructive way, a period of stability, or it could be just time lost while you wait for this thing to be done. Judgment was universally negative, as you'd expect, the feeling of being stigmatized and degraded. And constraint, interestingly, we would think of that as primarily negative, and it was mostly negative, but it also refers to the sense of being held, and sometimes being held is about being safe. So really interesting metaphors, and we didn't just use the pictures. We got the people involved to talk to us and to each other in focus groups with the pictures in front of them, and to articulate what they were trying to communicate. And also that allowed the viewer of the images to add layers of interpretation and meaning, which was powerful. And then in a second stage, we took some of the pictures from Supervisible and from Picturing Probation into a songwriting workshop. And we got a bunch of people who had experience of supervision, either as probationers or parolees, or as social workers, or as researchers, to co-write songs with skilled songwriters, which were stimulated by the images and which explored, again, the experience of being supervised. And we got a bunch of really interesting songs out of that process, but also 2 days of conversations in the development of those songs, which really sharpened our understanding. And in particular, by accident, I ended up as a songwriter in that project. We didn't have enough professional musicians, so I was drafted in and co-wrote a song called Blank Face with a guy called TJ. And TJ is on parole for life in Scotland, and he responded to 4 of the images in a very powerful way, and I'll spare you the details of the song. But talking to TJ for those 2 days, and then also he had previously been part of Supervisible as well, so going back over what his pictures meant to him became very influential in the analysis in the book, particularly in the 5th chapter, where I'm dwelling on what the experience of being supervised is. There's a lot of TJ in that chapter, and the song Blank Face is discussed in there, alongside a second song that I wrote in that workshop with somebody who had quite a different experience of supervision. So yeah, these were all, from the short story to the pictures to the songwriting, they were all ways to try to surface the experience of supervision and to help the reader imagine it better.
Which I love, because as you noted, I've been a part of, I've been exposed to those client surveys, and it's just not capturing, as you said, Fergus, the richness of that experience from what I refer to as the true subject matter experts. Let's change gears a little bit. Before I forget, I will leave a link for the book in the episode notes of this podcast, so if individuals are intrigued and want to track that down, I will leave a link in the show notes of this podcast. I first became aware of your work when I watched the groundbreaking documentary, The Road from Crime. You are one of the producers behind that documentary, along with Shad Maruna and Stephen Farrell, just to name a few. Can you walk our listeners who may not have seen this fantastic documentary just sort of through the chronology of how it came about and what that experience was like?
Okay, so Steve and Shad and I, kind of from about 2005 onwards, I think, were in regular communication, quite often taking part in seminars together or meeting at conferences. And there was growing interest in the UK specifically around desistance research and its implications for practice, particularly in probation, but more generally also. And to be honest, we were getting tired because we were being asked to go lots of places and give lots of talks. But we were also, frankly, sceptical about the value of us doing that. Because, when you're the academic and you get invited to give the talk, it's like people somehow expect you to sprinkle fairy dust, and there's no kind of methodology for how the talk is going to change anything, which is very unscientific now that I think about it. So we started thinking about what might actually help people think through the implications of the research in a more rigorous way. And we involved an expert in knowledge exchange called Dr. Claire Lightowler, who was at that point working in the University of Strathclyde, I think. She's moved around a couple of jobs. And what we came up with was the plan to make the film so that the film could communicate the basics around how we understood desistance, but more vividly and more effectively than we could in a talk. But we would also seed within the film ideas about the development of criminal justice and what needed to change in criminal justice. And then we completed the film and we gathered people together in workshops. And these workshops took place in lots of different venues. We did Belfast, Glasgow, Sheffield, London, and then the invitations started coming in, and I think the furthest I did was Adelaide in Australia. I did one in I can't remember the town, but it was in Massachusetts. I've done them in all sorts of places all over the world, and they follow a format called appreciative inquiry. So you go through 4 stages where you watch the film, and then you use it to kind of analyse the best of your current practice or experience, and then to begin to dream a better future. And you move from dream to design. So how do we make a dream realisable by designing things differently? And then what's the delivery plan? And that workshop process in its most extensive form was run over 2 days, separated by about 4 to 6 weeks. So we did the film a day together, had a break, thought about it, came back 6 weeks later, and then did the second instalment and came out of the workshops with clear propositions for change. And we, being academics, of course, we wrote that up and published the propositions and tried to work with as many agencies and groups as we could to take it further into practice, with varying degrees of success, I think it has to be said. But it was a very worthwhile project. I mean, the film is the great legacy, and although it's now getting on for 10 years old, I think it still has a kind of currency and potency, and it also has the great benefit of being subtitled in English, French, German, Spanish, Finnish, and maybe some other languages too.
Film is a great medium by which to communicate new thoughts and ideas, as opposed to, research articles, that, type of thing. Was it your thought going into the project that this would be the great way to sort of spread the gospel of desistance, or was that more of a serendipitous discovery along the way when you realized how much traction the film was really getting?
Yeah, no, I think we knew in advance that the film would communicate better than academic sort of lecture formats. Although, to be honest, that only fully became apparent to me in the process. There was some fascinating moments in the production process where, for example, we had worked with the film's director to kind of figure out what the scenes would be and the characters in each scene. Non-fictional, I add. This is different from in my later book. These are all real people talking about their experiences. And then it came time to write the voiceover, the narrative across the scenes. And when we wrote the first draft of that, it was Steve and Shad and I wrote that together, and we thought we were being the most succinct, plain-spoken people imaginable. and we laboured for a long time to get it down to the sort of word length that the director had requested, and we sent it to him quite pleased with ourselves. And a day or two later, he emailed us, and his message just read, "Why don't you trust my film?"
Wow.
And and what he was saying was, why are you telling people what to make of what we're showing people? And if people can see it, they don't need to be told.
Right.
So he was absolutely right. That what's the point of making a film and then writing a lecture to go alongside it? The point is that the film demonstrates and makes visible things that in words we can only describe, and then sort of third hand and imperfectly. So that taught me a lot, because it informed the development of some of the methods in Pervasive Punishment and in other work I've done more recently, where a lot of the time it's about trying to present in ways which are more open textured, which invite the reader, listener, viewer to engage with material and make something of it themselves, rather than being told by an academic what it all means.
I love that. I absolutely love that. And as we've been talking about, I appreciate your different approaches to, again, sort of disseminate this information, whether it's through ethnographies, the film. Let's talk about your Distant Voices project, which is yet again another way to sort of get the message out, Fergus.
Well, Distant Voices actually came straight out of the Road from Crime project. One of the people that we invited to the workshops is a woman called Alison Urey, who at the time had just finished up working with a youth organisation that used a lot of creative practices and was kind of looking for her next move. And coming to the workshops was one of her first engagements with criminal justice, although some of the young people that she'd worked with previously had their encounters with care systems and with juvenile justice systems. So she came already with a critical take, as you'd expect, but she was really blown away by the film and by the conversations in the workshops, and energised to do something about the counterproductive aspects of criminal justice. And we went to the pub, as you do, and we were having some beers and some French fries, you call them. We call them chips. Glad I got that right. Crucial cultural reference. And one of the messages that came out of the film project was that people just didn't understand. People in the general public just didn't understand what it was to go through criminal justice and also to attempt desistance in a hostile environment. And we were kind of struggling with this question of how do you change the environment for desistance and for reintegration. So not change the individual, not transform the person caught up in the system, but prepare the ground for their return or re-entry. How do you get a soft landing, basically, for re-entry? And we realised that one of the ways that human experience could be most powerfully communicated was through music, because music engages us both head and heart at the same time. You don't switch off your brain when you listen to music, you use it, but you're affected emotionally by music, or many of us are. At least we thought we were. So we thought, well, why don't we try and use music in some way in this context? So we dreamed up, first of all, an arts organisation called Vox Liminis, which Alison and I co-founded in 2013, I think, just off the back of the Road from Crime. And we set up Distant Voices as one of Vox Liminis' projects, specifically to explore reintegration through collaborative songwriting. So collaborative songwriting where the lived experience of people affected by justice, whether as offenders, victims, families, practitioners, academics, they could all get together and write songs together, facilitated by great musicians, of which we have many in Scotland. So we put those people in workshops together and started writing songs, and then we started sharing the songs that we had co-written, which was as important. So we take the songs to public audiences and we use them as a stimulus for dialogue. And when we do that, we find that the dialogue is so much richer because they have engaged cognitively and emotionally with the stories behind the songs and expressed in the songs. And we've been doing that ever since. So the project, Distant Voices, comes to its conclusion about a month from now, actually. We have an online festival which is called Bridging the Void, and which runs between the 1st and the 11th of November. And I think the timings are such that at least some of the events will be easily accessible to North American participants. You can find the sign-up details on Eventbrite if you just search for Bridging the Void. And 3 evening events, evening for us, which are all kind of musical, cultural events, and 3 lunchtime conversations. And the arc of that festival is that we start by exploring the void that punishment creates, and then we think about what are the foundations that we might need to build to bridge the void, and then we end kind of looking to the future together and thinking about how we can find responses to crime, social harm that are generative of social solidarity instead of destructive of it. That's the kind of core intent of the festival. But it should be a lot of fun. In fact, I know it will be, because we've just finished recording the evening events, which will be live streamed as live events with chat functions involved. But we pre-recorded them in the studio last week, and they're amazing. Really, really beautiful evenings of basically songs and stories explored together to try to help us imagine our way through the mess that is criminal justice.
I will endeavor to find a link from Eventbrite or do whatever I can to promote that.
The easy way to do it actually is to go to the project website, which is www.distantvoices.org.uk.
Okay. I will leave that for our listeners in the show notes of this podcast. Can I take a moment to hopefully not embarrass you and ask what it was like to visit Abbey Road Studios? off topic somewhat, but I became aware of that and I was pinching myself.
I should just explain that when we established Vox Liminis, the practice was always that nobody was allowed to be a bystander in creative processes. So I had to start writing songs, and I once I started, I couldn't stop. I found the bottle was uncorked, and the songs have been flowing ever since. One of them entered a competition last year at the behest of a friend, and amazingly, I won the competition. The prize of which was that the song got recorded at Abbey Road Studios, made famous by the Beatles, especially. We recorded it in July, and we're speaking, actually, Joe, 2 days ahead of its release date, the 6th of October. So it'll be on all the usual platforms by the time that this comes out. And the title is Blood Rush. For once, it has nothing to do with criminal justice. It's a love song of sorts, but it's novel in the sense that it's about staying in love for a long time as opposed to falling in love. So that's the twist.
There you go. We often talk in
I never answered your question. Abbey Road was amazing, exhilarating, exhausting, highly stressful, but an unforgettable experience.
Yes, one you'll remember for the rest of your life, I'm sure. I will watch for the release of Blood Rush and promote accordingly. Fergus, thank you so much for gracing us with your presence. This has been a long time in the making. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to you hopefully coming back onto the show to chat Desistance and more.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Be well, Fergus. Cannot thank Fergus enough for agreeing to be on the program. As you all heard, it is so much more than the latest and greatest evidence-based interventions. It really is a reimagining of how we are doing business, many of us in the criminal justice field. So many good things I could unpack from that interview. I want to let you all know, if you were intrigued and want to learn more about the content of what Fergus just referenced. I have left the website for Distant Voices in the show notes of this episode, www.distantvoices.org.uk. When you visit that site, you're in for a treat. You're going to see tabs for media, upcoming events, a blog post, which I encourage you all to start following. As mentioned in the interview, coming up here, November 2021, November 1st through the 14th, will be the Bridging the Void Distant Voices Festival. You can, again, visit the site and learn all about those fantastic events. And as Fergus noted, the Distant Voices Project is a project that explores crime, punishment, and reintegration through songwriting and other forms of creative expression. They have paired some of Scotland's best songwriters with people who've experienced the criminal justice system from lots of different angles. This includes people in prison, social workers, probation officers, prison officers, and what we would call wardens of prison, as well as those affected by an experience of crime, of participants in communities and families who receive people coming home from incarceration. You've really got to check it out. Again, the link is in the show notes of this episode. I have also left a link for Fergus's book, Pervasive Punishment, Making Sense of Mass Supervision. Please check it out. Back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, theparagongroup.llc.com, for training or presentations as to evidence-based practice or implementation, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email of thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is also on Twitter at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. Go ahead and give us a follow. You can also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us, ask them to subscribe to the podcast, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
I got lost up on the hills. I had to climb so I could find my way. You did your own traveling. On a sticky floor, you danced the blues away.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.
The thoughts, statements, and opinions of the host and cast members do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers and are those of the host and cast themselves. Any discussion regarding client statements, behaviors, actions, or crimes are purely fictional and are used only for the purposes of example. Any examples that could be deemed to be related to an actual individual or individuals are incidental.